There is no stronger advocate for free market capitalism than myself. I believe that the free market is the most efficient, most democratic way to allocate the goods of the land. But in a true free market economy, you can't make yourself rich without enriching your community and without making your neighbors or other people rich. What polluters do is they evade the free market, and they make themselves rich by making the rest of us poor. They raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for everybody else. They take an asset that already is producing benefits and has a value for their community, they liquidate it for cash, and they capture some of the profit for themselves. But they destroy the value of the asset, and they rob value ultimately from their communities, and they do it by evading the free market. And I'll talk about that in a second. But if you don't believe that, if you don't believe that environmental injury is deficit spending, look at the nations that didn't invest in their environment back in the 70s the way that we did in this country. All of our environmental investment in the United States began on Earth Day 1970. And I remember what it was like before Earth Day. I remember the Cuyahoga River burning for a week and nobody being able to put it out, with flames that were 8 stories high. I remember when they declared Lake Erie dead. I remember that I couldn't swim in the Hudson or the Charles or the Potomac when I was growing up, and what the air smelled like in Washington, D.C. when I was a boy. It wasn't even an industrial city. Some days you couldn't see down the block for the smog. We had the dust in our house every day because of soot. We had thousands of Americans dying in our cities of smog events. These young congressmen up on Capitol Hill don't remember that these days. They don't understand the benefits that we've gotten through these investments in environmental infrastructure. And many of our animals were going extinct. It was mentioned a moment ago that I'm a falconer and I've been interested in hawks, and I wrote a book on falconry, but I was interested, my mother says obsessed with hawks since I was probably 3 years old. I started training them when I was 11, and I'm a licensed master falconer today, and I just stepped down as president of the New York State Falconers Association, but I breed hawks and I train them and band them. But when I was 9 or 10 years old, we lived in Northern Virginia, and I would go up to Washington, D.C. Maybe once or twice a week with 9 or 10 of my brothers and sisters to eat lunch with my father at the Justice Department, or to go occasionally to visit my uncle, the president at the White House. And whenever we went to see Uncle Jack, I would always look down at the White House. I would always look down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., because you could see from the White House the old post office building, and on its roof there was a pair of Eastern and Adams peregrine falcons nesting, and they'd been there for generations. All the falconers knew about them. And this is our most spectacular predatory bird. It was salmon pink. It had a beautiful white coverlet on its nair. It was one of the largest subspecies of peregrine. It could fly somewhere around 200 miles an hour. And we could watch these birds come off of the post office and come down Pennsylvania Avenue at those speeds and pick pigeons out of the air, 40 feet above the heads of the pedestrians, and then fly them back to the cupola of the post office. And to me, seeing a sight like that was far more exciting than visiting my uncle at the White House. But that's a sight that my children will never see, because that bird went extinct in 1963 from DDT poisoning. And we have peregrines now back here in West Virginia and on the East Coast, but it's not the same bird. It's the hybridized progeny of 17 different subspecies that were mixed and matched and bred in captivity and then released into the wild. And in my view, it's nowhere near as spectacular as this creature that took 1 million years to evolve and then disappeared in the blink of an eye because of ignorance and greed. And in 1970, this accumulation of insults drove 20 million Americans out onto the street, 10% of our population, the largest public demonstration in the United States history, demanding that our political leaders return to the American people the ancient environmental rights that had been taken from our citizens during the previous 80 years. And the political system responded. Republicans and Democrats got together. Richard Nixon created EPA, signed many of these laws into effect, and we passed 28 major environmental laws over the next 10 years that protect our air and water and endangered species and wetlands and food safety, et cetera. And those laws have become the model for over 100 nations around the world that had their own versions of Earth Day and began making their own investments in the environment. And but there were nations also that didn't do that didn't have an Earth Day, and invariably those were countries that didn't have strong democracies. Because democracy and the environment are intertwined. You can't, and the reason for that is that the animals and the birds don't vote, and neither do the future generations, and they can't participate in the political process except in a democracy where you have strong, locally based democracies where individuals can stand up and inject those values into the political process. In a tyranny, they don't get represented at all, and that's why there's a direct correlation between the level of environmental injury and the level of tyranny in various countries. Over the long term, nothing but a democracy can offer sustainable protection of the environment. And if you look at the examples, the right-wing tyrannies of Brazil during the 70s, or Saddam Hussein's Iraq during the 80s and 90s, or the left-wing tyrannies in Eastern Europe and China and the Soviet Union, where they have now these scientific nightmares, science fiction nightmares that they have to cope with because of the decisions that they made, the anti-environmental, the short-term decisions that they made. Russia's a good example. Russia didn't have a democracy, didn't have an Earth Day, and it didn't have any environmental laws. It didn't have, for example, NEPA, which was our first and most important environmental law. That's the law, the federal law, and which has also been adopted by most of the states, by about 40 states, that says that before government destroys an important publicly owned resource, environmental resource, it has to first do an environmental impact statement. They didn't have that in Russia, and because of that, the Aral Sea is now, which was once the largest freshwater body on Earth after the Great Lakes, is now a desert. They didn't have a Clean Water Act, and because of that, the Sea of Azov in Russia, which was the richest fishery on Earth after the Chesapeake Bay, is now a biological wasteland. They didn't have nuclear regulatory review processes of the kind that we created after Earth Day in this country, and because of that, 1/5 of Belarusia is now permanently uninhabitable from radiation contamination. In Turkey, where I was this autumn, they don't have a Clean Water Act. 300 species have disappeared from the Marmara Sea over the past 15 years. The Black Sea will be dead within 10. In Thailand, where I also was this autumn, they don't have a Clean Air Act. You can see people on any street in Bangkok wearing gas masks and particle masks. The New York Times recently reported that the average child in Bangkok, and this is a city larger than New York, it's 10.5 million people, the average child who reaches the age of 6 has permanently lost 7 IQ points because the density of airborne lead contamination at ground level, because they didn't have a Clean Air Act that said you got to get the lead out of the gasoline. In China, they lose 100,000 people dead every year from smog events. One of the growth industries in Beijing is oxygen bars, where you literally have to go to buy a breath of fresh air. In Mexico City, if you own an automobile, you can legally only drive it 3.5 days a week. Smog inversions kill 10,000 people a year and shut down their principal state industries, sometimes for weeks at a time. In those nations, and many, 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 many others, environmental injury has matured into economic catastrophe. And that's what would have happened here if we didn't pass these laws back in the 70s, and that's what will happen if we allow a foolhardy Congress or a reckless White House to dismantle the laws that we have today, or to allow the state governors to simply stop enforcing our federal environmental laws, which is another one of the trends that we're seeing all over the country. And one of the things that I've done over the past 6 or 7 years is to constantly go around and confront this argument that an investment in our environment is a diminishment of our nation's wealth. It doesn't diminish our wealth. It's an investment in infrastructure. The same as investing in telecommunications or road construction. We've got to do it if we want to have any assurance that we're going to have a vital economy and that our children are as well. One of the other things that they love to say on Capitol Hill is that, well, what we've got to do now is we're going to dismantle the federal environmental laws. We'll return control to the states. because after all, that's local democracy and that's community control, and the states are in the best position to patrol and police and protect their own local resources.